The audience misses you. They want you back. We want you back. Please come home and let's finish the film together. We'll listen to you and meet your needs. If you'd like, we can even transfer you into a human body after birth.
I just cannot seem to learn my lesson, as the rabbit hole of analog horror has yet to let go of the hold it has on me. I need you all to understand that you are all the ones who held my hands and guided me towards this chaos. My dreams have been overtaken by analog horror, as not only do these fears attack me in my waking life, but now my sleeping one as well. I say all this, yet the level of excitement I feel going back to Monument Mythos cannot be outmatched. When I tell you I've been itching for some more, all the questions that have been plaguing my mind since we last left off. However, I don't think I'm going to be getting any answers, unfortunately. You see, I was originally getting ready to sit down and start doing a video on Season 3, but then I had remembered a lot of comments telling me about a side story that got posted called the Nixonverse, and I went back to check, and it sure looks as if this one comes before Season 3. Season 2 ends off showing us the Freedom Statue, which we had learned has the chopped up remains of Thomas and Nina. I am not yet sure, however, the level of control Thomas and Nina have over the statue, going toe to toe with the fallen angel, which is the amalgamation of a bunch of troops that had been vaporized and turned into one being. This clash between these two unstoppable forces leads to, from what the people have informed me, the horned serpent bursting out of the world egg, which I'm guessing had been cracked when the statue and the angels started their tumble. This results into the entire universe we have been following, known as the Deanverse, being wiped off the map. What does this mean for the rest of the series? Good question. We will just have to keep watching to find out. So enough recap. With this being a side story and all, supposedly in an entirely different universe, a recap may not even matter, because who knows how connected these two plots are going to be. So without further ado, everybody, let's dive right back into the Monument Mythos, the Nixonverse. The Last Son of Alcatraz, Episode 1.
Boy and girl. Your attention, please.
I'm going to try and digest all the information provided as smoothly as possible because a lot of people were having to bring up details I missed in the comments. I'm sorry guys, I'm not very observant. This episode begins with an echoing voice presenting a new radio program featuring the thrilling adventures of an incredible personality. Faster than an airplane and more powerful than a locomotive. Sounds like this guy is trying to describe Superman. All throughout this broadcast, in the background we see what looks like the destruction of the Deanverse we were following prior. Right off the bat, we are shown that this universe is going to play out differently, as James Dean, like he did IRL, dies in a car accident. But unlike real life, we are presented with images of a caped man flying in the sky as a voice describes him. The intentions behind this figure are unclear, as we get images of the figure coming down at a group of people and another photo of him holding a bomb under an aircraft. The next image is of two soldiers standing reading a newspaper, but as we close in from behind, we see giant legs. Are you telling me this caped figure is this incredibly large? We learn that this figure is referred to as the Last Son of Alcatraz, just like the episode is named. Current theory is that the Superman character is a product of the Deanverse destruction. In the flashing images we were getting in the beginning, perhaps that long string coming out of the burst is actually some sort of flight path he was on. I'm gonna be honest, the way the narrator spoke and how the echo sounded in the beginning was really unnerving and did not sit right with me. Definitely brought me back to that old analog horror fear. Even though Monument Mythos isn't as scary as the other analog horror series, it definitely has its moments where all I feel is terror. Where Monument Mythos succeeds, however, is in its world building. I am amazed at how much I can envision this world that has been created solely told in this analog format. The DDay Night, Episode 2. The episode begins on an image captioned as "The DDay Night is sent back by a powerful explosion." I don't know about you, but I would not have known that, so thank you, caption. We zoom into the knight in the corner. It says that the knight loses his helmet, which you can vaguely make out a helmet within the blur. The image rotates before landing back onto the knight's helmet before text at the bottom appears that says "The Horned Serpent lives," before we very quickly cut to "Free Will on D-Day, Alice Avenue for the World Nightly."
June 6, 1944. American units landed on Omaha Beach, unaware of the massacre that was about to occur. As those men waded into the water, they could not have known that their chances of survival that day were 1 in 4.
We learned some new history about D-Day that I am unfamiliar with. The narrator goes on about how all the soldiers did not have free will and that the atoms of these men led them all to a moment of almost certain death. I find that to be a strange way to word that, but whatever. We then look up and see what is referred to as the Night. What we know is that he is not of this world and that his atoms don't match this universe. I'm curious if this whole atom talk is going to mean something later on. If it doesn't, we can all go back to this moment and laugh. The video carries on to describe how this knight saved the soldiers that day after fate decided they were to die. I am assuming this knight is the same Superman figure that we saw flying around in the first episode, unless there are 2 caped figures that came from this destroyed universe and came into this one. We then fade onto a blurry image of the horned serpent's helmet, who I believe has been revealed as the knight. From the blurry helmet, a mangled human skull appears from the dark, and we zoom out to see it inside a big horned-like helmet. I know a lot of you guys have told me that the horned serpent is actually George Washington, who had been stretched along far enough to become snake-like. I can only imagine what this might look like, and I'm already terrified, especially after being given this imagery. Before we continue to get too far, I just wanted to say that if you found yourself enjoying what you're watching, be sure to hit all those neat buttons down below as it truly helps us out, and be sure to check out the links to the letterbox and the Instagram in the description to get more content. Alright, now you're able to pass through. The Queen of the Lunarians. Episode 3. This episode begins and we are shown what looks like an overhead map of the moon, where we see the landing area marked on the map. We then cut to someone holding a set of photos with text on screen saying that Grandma tried to burn these, before showing each image off one by one. As we are shown the images, we are shown a bright figure in the background get closer and closer before we see it stand in front of the Earth with its arms in the air. We are then shown quotes from the astronauts who discovered the Lunarian, before we hear the voice of Ed Dwight, the first man on the moon in this world. We get to hear a recording from the Queen, and to be honest, it did not sound like I was expecting.
Beauty is something else, something inexplicable that each person carries inside.
Then again, I am not too sure what I was expecting to begin with. The Queen says something very interesting and very threatening, talking about how a great division is coming and a lot of people are going to die because they don't know how to live. She also makes sure to mention beauty very frequently, as if it's a higher plane of existence, learning how to fly and rise above the level of normal humans, eventually gods and goddesses. Before anything else, Mike makes mention that there's air on the moon, before John yells out to Ed to blast the Queen. We then cut to a death certificate for John. His cause of death was written off as an eviction from reality due to a Lunarian encounter. I don't know why I ever think I'm going to get my questions answered. It appears that there are these figures that came over from the Great Division that took place in the Deanverse and are now in the Nixonverse with questionable intentions, where some figures seem to help, others seem to be more of a threat, and others seem to be a bit more confusing. The Lunarian didn't seem to intend any harm. But it also could be a case of hypnosis, and she was making the astronauts see something. Who knows? Maybe the next episode will clear some things up. Jesus in Vietnam, Episode 4. I am still not too sure what to make of this episode, but let's take a look anyway, shall we? This episode begins on an image of what I can only guess is from Vietnam. Before, I'm just gonna let you see for yourself.
And Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. And
this looks like an attempt to spread America across the globe. Hence, we see what Vietnam looks like after being taken over by the US. We also see the peace equation. Our freedom in our Christ is greater than your freedom in your Christ, and this equals world peace. We quickly cut to what looks like the moon, where text says, their peace is built on inequality, before we hear what sounds like a group of people praying as the camera pans along. From the darkness of space, a man glows from within. Everything brightens up as we zoom out and the music gets louder. Before it's captured Photograph of God by Ed Dwight, and we hard zoom in on his face, to whom I now believe is Richard Nixon. We flash to various photos of him and other people, and I gotta be honest, there is a very deep, sinister vibe I get from these photos. I don't know, I just don't like the way he's looking at me. A question I have currently mostly has to do with when everything is taking place. From what I can recall, the Great Division happens to the Deanverse in 2016, and the other universe in 2022. I suppose my assumption that the Nixonverse is just a parallel is wrong, because if this is supposed to take place after the Great Division, then how are Deanverse characters popping up and influencing Vietnam or the moon landing? Who knows? All I can do is keep watching. The Missing Eye of Jesus Christ, Episode 5. We are immediately given a bit more info on events. We learn that the last son, the caped figure from the first episode, had interfered with the Korean War, and after doing so, had gone home to his fortress in Alaska. It really seems like the Superman parallels are strong with this one. We see, however, that nuclear missiles followed him home, whether that be from Korea or whoever, but this isn't good for that Superman. We are then met with images of the nuking, and it looks pretty destructive. We see text telling us that the last son was captured before we cut to another video about this person's secret grandma. This time, however, we hear that the grandma had found the last son's missing eye in Alaska, and whoever is filming this video is trying to find it. As we zoom in on this pixelated image, we hear a narrated voice in the background go on describing the definition of eyeballs to us as if we are toddlers, before being flashed an image to who I imagine is our last son missing that eyeball. We learn that it wasn't Korea who nuked him either, but it was the US. We then see that the queen of the Lunarians' eye was also taken and was then put inside the last son. What are these people doing here? Text shows us that the Lunarian eye was used to brainwash the last son into impersonating Jesus. Perhaps this gives us some context to Jesus being in Vietnam, if that was actually happening. We spiral around a pretty hard to see image before being able to make out the image of the last son's eye. I don't know what kind of ending that was, but let's just discuss what we saw. As of right now, it appears that we are slowly following the aftermath of the Great Division and the destruction of the Deanverse. In the alternate universe, superhero-like figures seem to have came from the Deanverse and have made their way over and are interfering with world events and seeming to try to help people out. The Deanverse is technically ahead in the timeline, so is it possible these figures are trying to purposefully sway this universe's history? Who knows? Perhaps I'm over-speculating. The House in the Ocean, Episode 6. This episode is certainly a long one. This episode begins on someone's first house sighting, before we get car POV footage with more text on screen describing the feeling of forgetting what you were doing, basically. Like if you finished a movie, but when you try to think about what you just watched, your mind goes blank. And this is what our character is feeling right now. It doesn't appear like they remember any of this footage they have even recorded. We see a golden flag wave as it is the only thing we are able to remember, and that these flags are exclusively for house sightings. What does it mean by house sightings exactly? So it appears that there are giant houses in the middle of the ocean? I need to start taking these titles more literally right out of the gate. After this, we get into some pretty bizarre territory. We get footage of Obama talking about these wood chips that are flowing to shore from the house, and that they are killer wood chips and have already taken the lives of 200 people.
If you get a little closer, you can see the small wood chips that have been brought in by the tide. These chips are sharp and can easily puncture.
At the end of the clip, he suggests no one even looks at the house. Afterwards, we see reports of loud booms in Gainesville. These comments are something else, I tell you. What did you think your kids could have done? This was written off as a weapons test, but some people just are not buying it. The last comment was a link to a video that is pretty difficult to make out. It looks like a bright flash, but the comment and article had since been deleted. We cut to quote-unquote restored footage of Obama talking about these killer wood chips. Everything looks and sounds abundantly worse, and at the very end, instead of instructing everyone to look away from the house, he tells us to look at the house.
In the meantime, I suggest that
Yeah, no thanks. We learned that there was also a club of people for this house, and apparently all of the presidents were a part of it. It also had apparently completely shredded up Laura Bush. We hear audio of George and Laura Bush's final phone call before apparently getting ambushed. Ambushed. They talk about how they went out to shoot houses before what sounds like someone eating their microphone takes over. We see Laura's aftermath, and while it's hard to make out in the photo, you can tell someone got wrecked. George's aftermath photo, however, looks a bit more skewed and hard to make out, like someone's twisted his face up. We then get restored audio of the final phone call with the two. This time, instead of saying they get ambushed when the loud wind sound begins, it says that they are saved. We cut to a clip of Bush naming these wood chips that they plan to use to create a barrier between the house and the coast. The name is Killer Woodchips. I'm starting to get really confused right now. After this, we get a cool animated sequence, however. We hear the story of Eli. He was notified by a friend about a set of stars growing in size. Once Eli arrived at the friend's coordinates in the ocean, the boat was gone and he was out all alone. He looks at the cluster through the telescope, and while it may have looked like they were growing, they were actually falling towards him. The stars had stopped falling right above him, to which he could then see they weren't stars at all, considering organic tendrils came out from within. They speak to Eli, telling him that the Crescent King will arrive in 3 cycles and that he is the container. The stars jolt back up into the sky and send Eli into the ocean as the weight of his telescope had him snagged. Under the sea, he sees a whole bunch of broken and sunken ships. He floats down and sees his friend's boat and sees her down there as well. He swims back to shore and passes out from exhaustion. He says it felt like a whole day had passed once he had woken up. As if Eli was in Doctor Strange, he is separated from his physical being as he watches the giant shape of the Crescent King touch his physical form. Eli reports being able to hear the king's thoughts as it searched through his. Right before the last day, when the king would take his body, Eli scratched up and completely screwed up his face and completely screwed up his body so that the king would not want to take it anymore. He even ate a lot of sand. He falls unconscious again, and the last thing he remembers is the Crescent King falling from the sky. He doesn't remember much else, but the person interviewing him says that many other people have a very similar story to his. After the interviewer questions if Eli really believes that he is a container for the Crescent King, as if lifting up a mask, Eli rips his head off to reveal that of the head of the Crescent King before growing in size. We cut to the image of Laura Bush after getting annihilated, and we get text on screen telling us that there is no woman shown. In fact, there is no photo. It goes on to say that our mind recreates reality and takes observations and decides whether they are real or not. The reveal is then made that there was never a house in the ocean at all, and it only exists in our minds. There is only the house in your head. We are then shown an animation that Walt Disney had sent to the house, and we are gifted with watching the version it had restored. This is probably the most frightened I've been in the whole series. This animation looks to show off this brainwashing process the Crescent Moon is able to perform on people. The creepy mouse thing just wants to find friends, but it looks like his limbs keep getting ripped off before approaching the Crescent King himself underwater. We are then met with a message telling us that the king is now in our head too, and that our brain cells have been reorganized to remember him, and that by the time we finish this message, we will have already reprogrammed our brain to recollect him for the rest of our life. We are then shown what I think is the original animation, except this time the ending is different. This time it appears the Crescent King grows in size, with the face appearing over it. We then learn about a special effects robot called Chase, whose producers wanted it to be able to improvise, so they activated the AI within it so that she could have free will. What happens next is this chase machine going all the way down to the south. A video is being produced to get sent to the chase robot to convince her to come back, but it's said that she is already adding stars to our sky. This episode then ends with what looks like a giant bullet getting shot at the earth before it then disappears. If the last couple minutes did not make any sense to you, welcome to the club. But I think I come with answers for once. A comment I read cleared some things up about why this episode may feel a little off. If you remember in my season 2 video, I was a little confused by something at the end of the episode Fallen Father. Unfortunately, the creator of the series, Alex Kasanis' father, had passed away in 2021. House in the Ocean was a series he had made after his passing, but later after it had finished, he had taken everything down, only to give it a sort of reboot episode here in the Nixonverse. The whole idea behind the house in the ocean is supposed to pertain to the idea of something or someone only existing in one's memory, as they are no longer here, hence the message telling us the house isn't real. It's a really nice message to throw in here, and turns an episode I initially was really confused by, and makes it mean a whole lot more just after learning the backstory. I wish I could have seen the series as it came out, but I'm sure this episode did a good enough job giving me a gist of what it was like. Sea of the Last Sun, Episode 7. You know how in the last episode we learned the house wasn't actually real? Turns out it is a real house, only not in the way that we think. You see, the last son of Alcatraz, after causing all the damage to Vietnam in the form of Jesus, changed into the form of his childhood home and now sits at sea. All the nonsense we see in the last episode in relation to everything else is urban legends made up around the house in the ocean that is actually the last son. we listen in on a conversation between the last son and a Lunarian cloud ship who demands that the sun come and be their king. The last son doesn't want to do anything except live peacefully at sea, but the Lunarians are demanding and take him anyways. The next image we get leads me to believe that the DDay Night and the last son are in fact the same being, as it appears the Lunarians are what turns the last son into the Crescent King. I was immediately proven wrong. We learn that after being turned into the Crescent King, Lunarians used him to start to slowly destroy language in America. Changes were made subtly over time so that no one would notice. After a matter of time, people were no longer able to hear and speak properly at all. We hear a broadcast from Alice Avenue again. Oh, I get it now. Who goes on to tell the story of a boy who lived a pretty ordinary life. On a long drive to school, however, he was thinking about his role in the universe. During his drive, he was too distracted and struck another vehicle. Turns out, he was the guy who hit and killed James Dean. After struggling to pull him out and save him, the boy faints and has a dream of him jumping off a cliff to avoid an oncoming car. Instead of smacking the ground, he flew through the air. And when he woke up from his dream, he actually was able to take off and fly through the air. The boy turns out to be the DDay Night and vows to only help people after causing the James Dean accident, hence him going and helping out through all the wars. I am now starting to believe the DDay Night and the Crescent King are not actually the same thing, and are actually two beings that are going to have to fight, kinda like the statue and the angel from Season 2. However, right when Alice's broadcast is over, she is picked up and dropped from the top of the Chrysler building by the DDay Night. Holy shit. That's how this episode ends, so excuse me as we immediately need to get into the next episode to see if we get a continuation. DDay Nightfall, Episode 9. We get a bit more of an explanation towards the last episode. We appear to be presented with a message from the DDay Night explaining that his reasoning for killing Alice Avenue was him losing his temper. But he makes sure to mention that she is okay now, because in his world, statues hold souls. Here is evidence, before we are then met with a bunch of footage of a statue holding still. Statues holding souls, you say? This sounds more like our familiar antics that occur within the Monument Mythos. Is this supposed to be an explanation as to the statues? Who knows? We find out later on that the knight wears the head of this statue for a day, before being revealed to be a memorial statue for Alice Avenue. This guy needs to leave this lady alone. He already dropped her off quite that tall building. After wearing it for a day, he takes off the helmet, and we then see a really weird black figure, where an eye is supposedly pointed out to us before the words, "Grief can make you a monster," comes on screen. Is this supposed to be the DDay Night now? Let's keep searching. Nixon is God, Episode 10, an episode we've been waiting for. This episode begins with an autopsy report of Ed Dwight, the first man on the moon. It appears he had shot himself with a ray gun based on the report. We then hear an audio report of the incident, but a message at the bottom states something that leads me to believe it isn't actually Ed we are hearing. While on the moon, Ed ran into Richard Nixon, who we learn is the one who came flying out of the Horned Serpent at the beginning of the series. In order to test Earth to see if he would be safe to visit, he creates 3 super powerful beings and sends them out first to feel out the area. These beings being the Sun, the Night, and the Queen. It sounds also as if they were predestined to go crazy before images of the Sun being Jesus and the Night dropping Alice Avenue off the building. He then goes on to also say that it is inevitable that the Sun becomes the Crescent King, and that once the transformation happens, he's going to have to kill him before he becomes the most dangerous leader in the universe.
The king must perish. I am sorry, Mr. Dwight. No human is ever meant to hear what I have said.
Ending off this episode, we find out that Nixon had told Ed too much and ended his life, making it appear like a suicide by ray gun, I believe. This episode answered so many questions. I had previously thought that maybe it was the Superman-like last son who was what flung out of the Horned Serpent at the beginning, but it being Richard Nixon makes much more sense. It appears that each of these beings have at least a hint of recollection when it comes to Nixon's previous life in another universe. It is confirmed that they are all a part of Nixon, but it seems memories are starting to slip through, specifically with the DDay Night talking about his world having statues with souls. It's gotten very difficult to tell what is true or not in this series, I must say, but ladies and gentlemen, we are on our last episode of the Nixonverse. The Ed Dwight Paradox, Episode 11. This episode opens up as it repeats the note we got in the last episode about how Ed Dwight's voice is not featured, before showing us a title for the Ed Dwight Paradox. We cut to what looks like a chessboard as we hear the Queen of the Lunarians talking to the DDay Night. The Queen is going on about the prophecy she was initially talking about in earlier episodes, asking the Knight to rule alongside her with the King. The Knight basically says, "Fuck you, there is no prophecy, just me." We then learn of the Alcatraz checkmate, where we see the Knight attack the Lunarians and, supposedly like the Nixonverse, cause incredible destruction to the world. Not as bad as everything getting ripped apart, but yeah, it looks pretty bad. We see the text again. Grief made him a monster, as we see the giant Crescent King crying in the distance. I don't know about you, but I truly find this image really unnerving. I don't know, I don't like giant figures like this one. The king stands upright before the text changes on screen to "The horned serpent lives." After this, we cut back to Richard Nixon on the moon, seemingly talking to Ed Dwight. He reveals to us that he is actively avoiding physical confrontation between him and the super powerful beings, as he doesn't want to cause another universe-ending event. He tells us the only way to destroy the king is to render him as fiction, to tell stories about him and convince the world he is nothing but urban legend. It appears that the entire world of the Nixonverse then gets fictionalized as we zoom out and see that of a comic book cover for the entire series, with all of our godlike characters inhabiting the cover. It appears the concept behind the Crescent King is one that can't be thought about too strongly without making your brain hurt like it did mine, but it appears as if the Crescent King inhabits the bodies of those who conjure up his thought. So for instance, someone thinking about the Crescent King leaves your brain vulnerable to being the next body to become the king, I believe. This makes it to where Ed Dwight was able to turn these godlike creatures into urban legends, seemingly stripping them of all the power they previously had. I also believe it's hinted at the fact that the DDay Night is now the Crescent King, after performing his big world-ending event that he did during the chess match. Before coming to a close, we hear a female narrator tell us that Ed Dwight had never killed himself, and that it was Nixon who killed them. That Nixon did something we all wish we could do, and change the past, whether it be through the act of novelization or what. But she lets us know that in our world, Ed Dwight never went to space and went on to create monuments. I was initially worried that the Nixonverse series wouldn't carry the same charm and feeling the Monument Mythos seasons has given me so far, but boy could I not have been more wrong. If anything, there were many moments in the Nixonverse that terrified me more than I remember ever getting scared in previous Monument Mythos entries. Specifically, the use of audio throughout these episodes was something that really caught my attention. A lot of the imagery as well was very effective at creating scares. A lot of themes present throughout were also really fascinating to explore. I loved the idea behind the house in the ocean and how it ended up tying into the universe as a whole. I wholeheartedly thank you all who made it through the whole video with me. If you want to see me continue on and cover Season 3 and eventually try to cover the whole timeline, leave a like and comment down below and be sure to subscribe to the channel. Keep your eyes peeled for the next upload, and I will see you all shortly.